I'm a woman in my late 20s, and I got married earlier this year after dating my husband for 3 years. We had just settled into a modest 2-bedroom house we bought together, and for the first time in my adult life, I finally felt like I had a space that was truly mine. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with young families and older couples who had lived there for decades. It was the kind of place where people waved when walking their dogs, and kids rode their bikes up and down the street until dusk. For a while, everything seemed perfect. My husband's parents lived only 10 minutes away. At first, I thought that would be a good thing, close enough to visit easily, but far enough that we could maintain our independence. I quickly realized that distance meant nothing to them. They had a habit of dropping by unannounced, sometimes in the middle of dinner, sometimes early in the morning on weekends when we were still in pajamas. They would ring the bell and step right inside as if it were still my husband's childhood home. A few weeks after moving in, while I was making tea in the kitchen, my mother-in-law casually brought up an idea. She said it would be practical if they had a spare key, just in case of emergencies. The way she said it was light, almost like a suggestion tossed into the air. I smiled politely and brushed it off, saying that we had our security handled. But that first conversation set the tone for what was to come. It didn't stop there. Over dinners, during phone calls, even when we met for coffee, the subject of the spare key kept coming up. They always dressed it up as a matter of safety, of responsibility, as if not giving them a key was reckless. My husband would sit quietly, sometimes nodding, sometimes changing the subject, but never outright shutting it down. I had already told him I wasn't comfortable with the idea, yet he avoided picking a side. Then came the night they showed up with a printout of a news article about a local house fire. They slid the paper across our table as if it were evidence in a courtroom. According to them, if they had a key during an emergency like that, they could save lives. It felt dramatic, but they leaned into it, repeating the word safety like it was the only argument that mattered. The father-in-law, with a serious tone, said that refusing them a key was basically saying we didn't trust them. He let the words hang heavy in the room, and I could feel the tension building. It was no longer about practicality, it was now about loyalty and respect. And they made it clear they felt personally insulted. I tried to meet them halfway. I suggested installing a lockbox with a code we could share, the kind you mount outside, so that in a real emergency they could access the house. But the idea was dismissed before I even finished explaining it. According to them, only a physical key would do. That night, after they left, my husband and I argued. He told me maybe it wouldn't hurt to just give them one key to keep the peace. I stood firm. I reminded him that this was our first home together, and that how we set boundaries now would affect our marriage later. He sighed, saying he didn't want to fight about it, but his hesitation told me he wasn't really on my side. From that point on, the pressure ramped up. Every visit seemed to circle back to the same topic. Sometimes it was framed as a joke, with the mother-in-law chuckling about how paranoid I was. Other times it was guilt, with them saying that family should look after family. It became clear they weren't going to let this go. The worst moment came at a family barbecue. Surrounded by cousins, aunts, and uncles, my mother-in-law decided to take a jab at me. With a loud laugh, she told everyone that I was locking out family because I didn't want to give them a key. People chuckled awkwardly, but I could feel my face burn. It wasn't just teasing, it was mocking me in front of everyone, painting me as the paranoid daughter-in-law who didn't trust anyone. My husband stood nearby, silent, and that silence said everything. From that day, the frustration grew heavier. I noticed my husband's discomfort, but I also noticed how unwilling he was to actually confront his parents. It was as if he hoped it would all just blow over on its own. But the truth was that the issue was building momentum. His parents saw his silence as weakness, and every time he didn't speak up, they pushed harder. It was then that I realized I couldn't just wait for him to step in. I needed a plan. Their insistence on a spare key wasn't about emergencies or safety. It was a test of how much control they could exert over our lives. If I caved now, I knew it wouldn't stop here. It would open the door, literally and figuratively, to more interference. So I started thinking ahead, quietly preparing for what I would need to do if they ever forced the issue. Because to them, it wasn't just a key. To me, it was the first real battle over the privacy and boundaries of our marriage, and I wasn't about to lose it. Not long after that family barbecue, the pressure from my in-laws finally broke through. I came home from work one evening, and my husband casually mentioned that he had given his parents a spare key. He framed it as no big deal, saying it was easier than dealing with constant arguments. I stood there stunned, because he had done it without even talking to me. I didn't blow up at him. Instead, I decided to watch and wait. I wanted to see what they would do with that key. It didn't take long to get my answer. That same weekend, I returned home from running errands and noticed small changes. A throw pillow was on the opposite end of the couch. A mug that I left in the sink had been washed and placed on the drying rack. They weren't big things, but enough that I knew someone had been inside. My stomach sank because the only people with access were my husband and his parents. A few days later, one of our neighbors stopped me while I was getting the mail. In a casual tone, she asked if my husband's parents had moved in. When I asked why, she mentioned seeing their car in the driveway during the middle of the day while both of us were at work. She even joked about how lucky we were to have parents helping around the house. That confirmed everything. That evening, I searched the laundry basket in the hallway. I had left clothes piled up, but now they were folded neatly and placed on the bed. My mother-in-law had been inside, folding my laundry. That was the final piece I needed to be certain. When I confronted my husband, he dismissed it. He insisted his parents wouldn't do something like that and told me I was imagining things. That response told me I couldn't rely on him to fix it. I needed proof. I ordered small cameras online, ones that looked like everyday objects, an alarm clock for the living room, a charging hub for the hallway, a frame in the kitchen. I placed them quietly around the house, making sure they blended in. Setting them up gave me some peace, because finally I would have evidence instead of suspicion. The very first recording came within 2 days. While I was at work, the front door opened, and in walked my in-laws. They didn't knock. They didn't call. They stepped inside as if it was their home. The footage showed them opening the fridge, commenting about what was inside, and then turning on the television to watch a show. It was surreal to watch strangers, because that's what they felt like in that moment, make themselves comfortable in my house. On another recording, my mother-in-law wandered into the kitchen and began opening drawers, muttering to herself as she rummaged through things. She wasn't just checking on the place, she was snooping. She opened the drawer where I kept important papers and lingered there before moving on. That night, I queued up the footage and played it for my husband. He watched his parents walk through our living room, sit on our couch, and poke through our kitchen. He sat in silence, shifting uncomfortably. When the clip ended, he muttered that maybe they were just making sure everything was okay. Even faced with the evidence, he tried to soften it. I told him flat out this was a huge breach. I didn't raise my voice, but I made it clear something had to change. He nodded, but instead of demanding the key back, he said he would ask them to at least call before coming over. That was his solution. The next day, he had that conversation with them. He came home later and said it went fine, that they understood. But less than a week later, the cameras picked them up again. They unlocked the door in the middle of the day, stepped inside, and went about their routine. No phone call, no text, nothing. His request had gone in one ear and out the other. I came home that night and noticed the cushions had been moved again. The fridge looked slightly rearranged. I pulled up the recordings and sure enough, there they were, once again in our space without permission. I showed my husband the new clips. This time, he didn't try to argue. His face tightened as he realized they had ignored his words completely. He admitted something had to be done, but still seemed unsure how to handle it without causing a bigger fight. That was the moment I decided I couldn't wait for him anymore. If he wasn't going to act, then I would. I needed to make it undeniable, not just to him but to everyone. His parents were crossing a line, and the only way to stop it was to drag their actions into the open. So I started planning. I decided to host a family dinner. Invite not just his parents but his sister, cousins, and a few relatives. I would make sure everyone was there to witness what I had been dealing with. But instead of words, I would let the footage speak for itself. In the meantime, I kept collecting evidence. Each time they entered, the cameras caught them. Once, his father walked into the pantry and commented about the groceries. Another time, his mother folded laundry again and placed it neatly in the closet. Each incident added to the pile. I saved every clip, labeling the dates and times. I knew the moment would come when I could put it all together. Finally, I set the date for the dinner. I cooked, cleaned, and prepared everything like it was a normal get-together. The in-laws arrived cheerful, acting as if nothing was wrong. They laughed and chatted, slipping in little comments about how helpful it was to have a spare key. I let them talk, smiling politely, all while knowing what I had ready on my laptop. My husband noticed me setting it up earlier in the day, but I told him it was for a slideshow of photos from our wedding. He didn't ask further. That night, as everyone sat around eating dessert, my mother-in-law made her slip. She bragged about how sometimes they check on things when you're gone, just to help out. She said it like it was funny, like everyone would find it charming. That was my opening. I got up, walked to the laptop, and played the footage. One by one, clips of them entering uninvited, rummaging through drawers, folding laundry, sitting on the couch, and watching TV filled the screen. The room went silent. Faces of cousins and siblings turned from shock to discomfort. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended them. It was all there, undeniable. My father-in-law tried to brush it off, saying they were making sure the house was safe. My mother-in-law insisted folding laundry was just her way of helping, but the looks from the rest of the family said otherwise. In that moment, my husband finally admitted out loud that their behavior was not okay. He was cornered by the evidence and the reactions of his family. He couldn't dismiss it anymore. And that was just the beginning, because once their actions were dragged into the light, the fallout spread faster than I imagined. I decided to follow through with my plan and make the next family dinner the moment everything came out in the open. I invited my husband's parents, his sister, cousins, and a few close relatives. On the surface, it looked like a normal family gathering, but behind the scenes, I was preparing something else entirely. The day before the dinner, I checked all the clips again. The cameras had caught his parents multiple times entering uninvited, eating food, snooping in drawers, and folding laundry. I loaded everything onto my laptop, queuing it up in order so that when the time was right, all I would have to do was press play. I placed the laptop on the console table in the living room, angled so everyone could see if I projected it onto the television. When the dinner night arrived, the house was full of chatter and laughter. The smell of food filled the kitchen, and relatives caught up with each other in the living room. My in-laws walked in smiling, acting as though nothing had ever happened. They carried dessert, cracked jokes, and seemed completely at ease. Throughout the evening, they made little comments about how helpful it was for them to have a key, slipping it into conversations like it was some funny family quirk. The meal went smoothly, but the real moment came during dessert. While everyone was still gathered around the table, my mother-in-law let it slip. With a laugh, she said that sometimes they check on things when you're gone, just to help. She looked around, expecting others to find it charming. That was my opening. I stood up and walked to the laptop. Without a word, I connected it to the television. The first video began to play. The footage showed my in-laws walking straight into the house without knocking, heading for the fridge, and helping themselves to drinks. Another clip showed my mother-in-law rifling through drawers in the kitchen, muttering as she moved things around. A third clip captured them sitting on the couch, flipping through channels like they lived there. The room went quiet. Conversations stopped. Forks were set down. The only sound was the video playing. Cousins exchanged uneasy looks, and his sister stared at the screen in shock. Nobody spoke, but the silence was louder than anything. My father-in-law broke it first, saying they were only making sure the house was safe. He shrugged as if it was no big deal. My mother-in-law quickly added that folding laundry and tidying up was her way of helping, like it was some kind of kindness. Their words felt flat against the footage everyone had just seen. The cousins didn't hide their reactions. One whispered to another, shaking their head. His sister leaned back in her chair, clearly disturbed. The evidence spoke for itself. This wasn't about safety, and it wasn't about kindness. It was about crossing boundaries. In that moment, my husband couldn't dodge it anymore. He looked around the table, then back at the screen. Finally, he admitted that what his parents had been doing was unacceptable. It was the first time he said it in front of everyone. I took the chance to make sure it was crystal clear. I explained that the cameras were set to back up automatically, and that starting that night, clips of any uninvited entries would go straight into the shared family thread. Every relative at that table would see it the moment it happened. That was when the anger hit. My in-laws' faces flushed red. My mother-in-law accused me of humiliating them. My father-in-law muttered that I was tearing the family apart. They raised their voices, defensive and sharp. But I didn't argue back. Instead, I calmly repeated the same line they had used from the very beginning. The cameras, I said, were for safety. If they had nothing to hide, then there was nothing to worry about. The relatives backed me up. One cousin spoke up and said no one had the right to walk into someone else's home without permission. Another added that emergencies were one thing, but what we had just seen wasn't an emergency. Even his sister, who usually stayed quiet in conflicts, said it was obvious the boundaries had been crossed again and again. My in-laws didn't like the shift in the room. They realized they weren't getting sympathy or support. Their attempt to defend themselves only made it worse. I finished it by making the boundary clear. I announced that unless the key was returned, the cameras would remain on, and every recording would continue to be shared with the family. No more quiet intrusions, no more pretending it was a favor. It was out in the open now, and everyone knew what was going on. The tension in the room was thick, but it was also final. They couldn't deny what everyone had just seen. They couldn't twist it or turn it into paranoia anymore. That night, when the dinner ended, people left talking quietly among themselves. Cousins patted my shoulder on the way out, and his sister gave me a look that said more than words could. The in-laws left in a rush, avoiding eye contact, their cheerful entrance long forgotten. What struck me most wasn't just the silence or the embarrassment. It was the fact that for the first time, everyone else had seen it. It wasn't just me fighting this battle anymore. It was out in the open, undeniable, and now the whole family knew the truth. But what I didn't realize then was that exposing them in front of everyone wasn't going to make them back down. It was only going to make them push harder. The fallout from that dinner spread quickly. The very next morning, my phone buzzed with messages from cousins and siblings-in-law. Some sent short notes saying I did the right thing. Others sent longer messages about how uncomfortable it was to watch the videos. One cousin even admitted that seeing it play out in front of everyone made them rethink how often they had ignored boundaries in their own relationships. What struck me most, though, was a message from my husband's sister. She confessed privately that she had been dealing with the same thing years earlier, back when she lived in her first apartment. Their parents had shown up without warning, let themselves in, and gone through her things. She said she never confronted them directly because she didn't have the evidence and didn't want to start a war. Seeing the footage at my house brought back all those memories, and she told me she wished she had spoken up then. That same day, my husband's brother-in-law called to check in. He wasn't surprised at all. He told me that in his view, my mother-in-law had always believed she had the right to involve herself in her children's private lives. He even joked that she would probably snoop in a locked safe if she had the chance. It was clear from these conversations that what happened at my house wasn't new behavior. It was just the first time someone caught them in the act. For a week after the dinner, there was silence from my in-laws. No visits, no phone calls, no messages. On the surface, it seemed like the situation had settled, but the conversations in the family group chat told a different story. Cousins were still talking about it, replaying what they saw, and agreeing that boundaries had to exist. My in-laws were the only ones not engaging, which made their silence stand out even more. Then one afternoon, I pulled into the driveway after work and noticed the curtains in the living room slightly moved. I knew I hadn't left them that way. My stomach dropped, and I went straight to the camera feed. Sure enough, there it was, a recording from earlier in the day, showing my in-laws unlocking the door, stepping inside, and heading straight for the pantry. They opened cabinets, commented on the groceries, and even rearranged a few items. It was like the dinner had never happened. When my husband came home, I showed him the new clips. This time, he didn't have excuses. He sat there watching his parents snoop around again, ignoring everything he had asked them to do. He finally admitted the key had to be taken back. We drove to his parents' house that weekend. The moment we brought up the spare key, the atmosphere shifted. His father's face hardened, and his mother's voice rose almost instantly. They accused us of being ungrateful, of betraying family trust. My mother-in-law cried, claiming I had turned her son against her. His father picked up the phone mid-conversation and started calling relatives, spinning the story into how I was controlling and cutting them out of their son's life. What they didn't count on was that the relatives had already seen the truth for themselves. The video clips had erased any doubt. One by one, the relatives they tried to call pushed back, saying they had no right to enter our house uninvited. That only made my in-laws angrier, because they realized their usual tactics weren't working. After nearly an hour of back and forth, my husband asked directly for the key. His father refused, saying he would never hand it over. His mother insisted they needed it in case something ever happened. That was when I calmly told them that the front door locks would be changed that same weekend if they refused. The words hit like a slap. My father-in-law's face went red, and my mother-in-law's tears turned into shouting. We left soon after, but the reaction didn't stop there. That night, extended family members started getting calls from my in-laws complaining about how we had humiliated them. Some relatives sent me messages saying I had gone too far, but most said they understood why we did it. Even my husband's sister and brother-in-law backed us up, saying it was the only way to protect our privacy. Back at home, the peace was immediate. Knowing their key no longer worked gave me relief I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, the house felt like ours again. I installed the new locks myself, double-checking them and making sure no spare copies existed. The next morning, though, I spotted my father-in-law's car parked down the street. He didn't approach the house, but he sat there for nearly 20 minutes before driving off. Later that week, he tried again, testing the front door before realizing it had been changed. The cameras caught him tugging on the handle and walking away quickly. The footage was saved and filed with the rest. I wasn't going to let it slide. That weekend, we received a letter slipped under the door. It wasn't an apology. It was a handwritten note from my mother-in-law, saying that family looks after family, no matter what locks are on the doors. It wasn't threatening, but it carried a message that they weren't backing down. I showed it to my husband, and he stayed quiet for a long time before finally admitting that his parents were not going to change unless something forced them to. That was when I decided it was time to strengthen our security even further. I upgraded the locks again, this time to a smart system that notified my phone every time the door opened. I added more cameras, this time outside, covering the front porch, driveway, and backyard gate. Within days, the new cameras caught footage of my father-in-law testing the locked back gate. He rattled it, looked around, and then walked back to his car. Once again, it was all on video. I archived the clip, labeling it with the date and time. Every step they took, every attempt they made, was being documented. By then, the relatives who supported us began voicing their frustration too. Cousins told me they were tired of getting calls from my in-laws complaining. One even blocked their number after receiving 3 late-night rants about how I was destroying the family. It was clear the situation was no longer just about a spare key. It had grown into something bigger, a fight about control, respect, and whether or not my in-laws could accept boundaries. And while I had expected them to back down after the dinner, after the evidence, and after the lock change, it became obvious they weren't going to let it go so easily. They were ready to escalate, and I was ready too. The week after changing the locks, things escalated faster than I expected. It started on a Saturday morning when I heard loud banging on the front door. My husband and I looked at each other before checking the cameras. His parents were standing on the porch, pounding on the door and shouting loud enough that a couple of neighbors peeked out their windows. Their old key didn't work anymore, and they were furious. My father-in-law rattled the doorknob, trying it again and again, while my mother-in-law yelled about being locked out of their own son's home. The scene was loud, messy, and completely public. Neighbors across the street stood on their lawns pretending to water plants while watching. The shouting carried down the block. I knew I couldn't let it keep escalating, so I grabbed my phone and called the non-emergency police line. I explained that 2 people were trying to enter our home without permission and refusing to leave. When the police car pulled up, the officers walked over and spoke with my in-laws first. My husband and I stayed inside while the cameras kept recording everything. From the window, I could see my mother-in-law gesturing wildly and pointing at the house. My father-in-law waved his hands, clearly frustrated. The officers came to the door next. We stepped outside, and I explained calmly that his parents had a spare key in the past, but their access had been revoked. The locks had been changed, and they had no right to try and enter anymore. The officers nodded and turned back to my in-laws, telling them that just because they used to have a key didn't mean they had unlimited access. The officers warned them to leave and not come back without an invitation. My mother-in-law's face went red, and my father-in-law clenched his jaw. They reluctantly walked back to their car, muttering as neighbors looked on, while the officers made it clear further attempts could lead to charges. When the police car pulled away, my husband turned to me, shaken. He admitted he had never thought his parents would take it this far. He finally said out loud that I had been right all along. But the story didn't end there. Later that evening, a handwritten note appeared in our mailbox. It was from my mother-in-law. The letter rambled about family being obligated to look after each other, about how we were disrespectful, and about how changing the locks didn't erase blood ties. It wasn't threatening, but the tone made it clear she wasn't backing down. The next day, my father-in-law parked across the street. He sat there for nearly half an hour, just watching the house. He didn't get out of the car, didn't approach the door, just sat there. My outdoor cameras recorded everything. Over the next week, he did it multiple times. He would show up, park across the street or down the block, and sit there silently. Once, the cameras even caught him testing the latch on the back gate before quickly walking away. At that point, I upgraded the security system again. I added motion-activated floodlights around the house. I set the cameras to send live notifications to my phone whenever someone stepped onto the property. I made sure every angle, front porch, driveway, side yard, backyard was covered. The footage kept piling up. One night, the cameras caught my father-in-law creeping up to the back fence. He rattled it again, then left when the floodlights clicked on. The recording was crystal clear, and I saved it with the rest. Meanwhile, relatives started reaching out. Some cousins told me they had gotten angry phone calls from my in-laws, claiming we were treating them like criminals. A few suggested I should ease up, but more of them backed me, saying parents or not, no one had the right to act that way. One neighbor also stopped me while I was getting the mail. She said she saw my in-laws screaming at the door that Saturday morning and wanted to know if everything was okay. I explained briefly that we had boundary issues, and she nodded knowingly, saying she had already guessed as much from their behavior. That weekend, my husband's sister invited us over. She and her husband said they had been bombarded with calls from his parents too. They admitted they were tired of being dragged into it, and that they agreed what his parents were doing was way out of line. It was the first time my husband heard his sister say it directly. Back at our house, the tension kept building. My in-laws left another note, this one angrier, demanding we stop treating them like strangers. The handwriting was jagged, words underlined 3 times. My husband looked at it, sighed, and tossed it in the drawer. The next big escalation came a few days later. My husband and I were eating dinner when the motion alert went off. I checked my phone and the camera showed my father-in-law back at the gate. This time, he had a small flashlight in his hand and was peering into the yard. I noted the incident and saved the footage, planning to involve the police only if they tried to enter again. When the officers arrived, I showed them the footage on my phone. They watched silently, then nodded. They went to speak to my father-in-law, who was still parked down the street. I couldn't hear the conversation, but after a few minutes, the officers came back and told us they had warned him again. They said if he returned to the property without permission, we could press trespassing charges. That warning seemed to land, at least temporarily. For the next week, the street was quiet. No parked car, no rattling gates, no notes. But the silence didn't bring peace. It felt like the calm before another storm. During that time, I went even further with preparations. I backed up every single video clip and stored them on a cloud account and an external drive. I wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, there would always be proof. One evening, my husband and I sat together and went through everything. Watching the clips one after another, the uninvited entries, the snooping, the shouting on the porch, the late-night gate testing, made it undeniable. He finally admitted we couldn't just hope they would stop. We needed a real plan. That night, we drafted one. It started with a united front between him, me, his sister, and her husband. The next step would be a direct confrontation as a group, not just the two of us. We knew it would be ugly, but we also knew his parents would not stop unless the entire family stood together. As I shut down the laptop, the plan in place, I realized the escalation wasn't just about locks or cameras anymore. It was about whether or not my in-laws could accept that they no longer controlled their son's home. And judging by everything that had already happened, I knew they weren't going to give up easily. After the police warning, there was a stretch of quiet. No shouting on the porch, no parked car across the street, no notes slipped under the door. But both my husband and I knew it wouldn't last. His parents weren't the type to back down. The silence felt like they were regrouping, not surrendering. That was when I suggested bringing his sister and brother-in-law into it fully. They had already voiced their support, and after the last confrontation, it was clear we couldn't keep handling this alone. My husband agreed, so we set up a meeting at his sister's house. It was neutral ground, away from our home, and far enough from his parents' place that they couldn't just barge in. On the day of the meeting, we arrived early. His sister greeted us, already tense, and her husband had a folder of notes he had written down from all the calls and incidents he'd witnessed. He wasn't messing around. They wanted to do this properly. When my in-laws arrived, the mood was stiff. They walked in, expecting perhaps a family dinner, but instead found the four of us sitting around the table with evidence laid out. My laptop was open with the clips queued, and the note they had left in our mailbox sat in the center of the table. We began with a calm explanation of why everyone was there. My husband laid out the timeline, how they were given a key, how they used it without permission, how they ignored every request to stop. He explained that the locks had been changed and that the police had already been involved once. His sister backed him up, reminding them how she had dealt with the same kind of intrusions years earlier. She said it plainly, this wasn't just about me, it was a pattern of behavior. I pulled up the footage of my father-in-law testing the back gate with a flashlight. I let it play without commentary. The image was clear, him rattling the lock, looking around, then walking away. His sister-in-law leaned forward and asked if they understood how that looked to everyone else. My mother-in-law exploded first. She shouted about protecting her son, about being accused unfairly, and about how I had poisoned him against his family. Her voice shook the room, but nobody moved. Her husband jumped in, accusing us of humiliating them in front of the entire family with the dinner footage. That was when the brother-in-law spoke up. He slammed his notes on the table and told them flat out this wasn't protection, it was control. He listed the late-night calls, the uninvited entries, the endless complaints. He said the entire family was exhausted, and their behavior had pushed everyone too far. For the first time, my husband spoke firmly to them. He told his parents they had crossed every possible line. He reminded them of the police standing on our porch, of the neighbors watching, of the videos everyone had seen. His voice didn't waver. We laid down the ultimatum. Unless they respected boundaries, they would no longer be invited to family gatherings, birthdays, or holidays. His sister and her husband backed it up immediately. The message was clear. It wasn't just me drawing the line anymore. It was both of their children. My mother-in-law's face twisted with betrayal. She cried, accusing her own daughter of turning against her. My father-in-law stood, furious, saying we were choosing outsiders over blood. He stormed toward the door, his wife following, both of them shouting that they had been betrayed by their own family. The door slammed, leaving silence behind. We all sat at the table for a long time after they left. My husband's sister poured drinks for everyone, her hands shaking slightly. She admitted she had always been afraid to stand up to them, but now that it was out in the open, she wasn't afraid anymore. We talked late into the evening, going over everything. We agreed on a united front. No contact unless it was respectful. No visits without invitations, and no tolerance for intimidation. Everyone promised to back each other up if the parents tried to pit us against one another. The next few days brought the aftermath. My in-laws started calling relatives, spinning the story. They claimed their children had turned on them, that I had manipulated everyone, that they were the victims. But this time, the story didn't stick. Too many people had seen the videos. Too many had witnessed the police at the door. Too many had been dragged into their late-night rants. Cousins sent me messages saying they weren't buying into the lies. One aunt told my husband directly that she supported us. The more his parents tried to twist things, the more isolated they became. Meanwhile, the surveillance continued. I didn't take down the cameras or the floodlights. I wanted everything documented, just in case. A few nights later, one camera caught my mother-in-law walking by the front of the house, glancing at the windows before hurrying away. She didn't try to come inside, but the sight of her lingering outside was unsettling. I saved the clip like all the others. My husband's sister wasn't spared either. She called me one night after finding her mother parked outside her driveway. The headlights had been off, and the car sat there until her husband went outside to confront them. The car pulled away, but the message was clear. They weren't letting go quietly. We talked again as siblings. My husband and his sister agreed that if this continued, the next step would be legal action. They didn't want it to reach that point, but both of them finally admitted it was possible. The following weekend, we had a smaller family gathering at the sister's house. The parents weren't invited, and for the first time in months, it felt peaceful. No tension, no outbursts, no waiting for drama, just laughter and normal conversations. It was a glimpse of what life could be like without the constant shadow of interference. But even in that peace, we all knew it wasn't over. My in-laws weren't the type to give up after one confrontation, even if the entire family stood against them. They had lost ground, but they hadn't accepted defeat. When we left that night, I looked at my husband and said what we were both already thinking. This was no longer about a spare key. It was about whether his parents could accept that their control was gone. And deep down, we both knew they weren't ready to accept that yet. After the confrontation at my sister-in-law's house, things went quiet for the first time in months. No more cars parked across the street, no pounding on the door, no notes shoved in the mailbox. For weeks, the only people walking up our driveway were delivery drivers and neighbors waving hello. It was strange to feel the house return to being just a home instead of a battlefield. About 3 weeks into that calm, my husband's phone lit up. It was his mother. The call lasted only a minute, but the message was clear. She wanted to meet to clear the air. She didn't demand access, and she didn't raise her voice. She simply asked for a sit-down. We agreed, but only under one condition. The meeting would take place in a public cafe, not in our home. I wasn't about to undo everything by letting them step foot inside again. My husband relayed that, and they accepted. On the day of the meeting, we arrived early. The cafe was busy enough that we weren't isolated, but quiet enough for a serious conversation. My husband's parents walked in, tense and guarded. For the first time, I noticed they weren't walking with the same confidence they usually carried. Without a spare key, without the ability to show up uninvited, they didn't hold the same leverage anymore. We sat down, and the conversation began slowly. My mother-in-law started by admitting she had been a little overbearing. She tried to soften it, framing her actions as being motivated by love and concern. She said folding laundry, entering unannounced, and checking on groceries were her ways of caring. She was careful with her words, but the undertone was the same. She didn't see what she had done as truly wrong. I didn't let it pass. I listed the actions one by one, walking in without permission, rummaging through drawers, shouting on our porch, testing the gate, parking outside to watch the house. I laid them out like a record of events, each one undeniable. Then I explained how those actions had destroyed trust. My husband didn't stay quiet this time. He spoke firmly, backing me up point for point. He said our home was now off limits unless they were explicitly invited. No gray areas, no emergency excuses. The line had been drawn. His father bristled. He muttered that it was unnatural for parents to be shut out of their son's house. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, clearly waiting for my husband to soften. But my husband cut him off. He told him the boundary was final. That was when I spelled it out clearly. Any future attempt to enter uninvited would involve the police immediately. There would be no warnings, no second chances, no family meetings to talk it out. The next violation would become a legal issue. While we sat at that table, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my sister-in-law. She and her husband had been waiting for an update, and she wrote that if things went south, they were ready to step in again. I showed the message to my in-laws, a reminder that this wasn't just me drawing the line. It was the entire family united. Faced with no sympathy and no loopholes, my in-laws finally gave a reluctant nod. They didn't apologize outright, but they admitted they understood what would happen if boundaries were crossed again. It was obvious they felt wounded. My mother-in-law's lips pressed tightly together, and my father-in-law's jaw was clenched the whole time. But their usual tactics, crying, guilt, shouting, didn't work anymore. They realized that manipulation no longer had power. We left the cafe with clear guidelines. All visits had to be arranged at least a day in advance. Every visit needed confirmation. No showing up because they happened to be in the neighborhood. No slipping notes into the mailbox or parking down the street to watch the house. Everything had to be direct and agreed upon. The following months tested those guidelines. At first, they called occasionally to request visits. We kept it simple. If the timing worked, we said yes. If not, we declined. To my surprise, they accepted the answers without argument. The first time they showed up on schedule, they rang the doorbell like normal guests. No key, no walking inside, no rummaging. They sat in the living room, drank coffee, and left when the visit ended. As the weeks turned into months, the pattern held. They no longer left notes. They no longer parked outside. They no longer tried to slip back into old habits. Every interaction was on our terms, and every visit felt like a guest visiting, not like someone claiming ownership. One afternoon, my husband's sister called me, surprised. She said their parents had stopped the late-night phone calls, stopped complaining about me, and even started showing up politely at her house too. It wasn't warmth, but it was compliance. She told me she thought the confrontation had finally changed the dynamic. Looking back, I realized the shift had happened because we never caved. We documented everything. We showed the truth to the family. We stood united. Every manipulation they tried, guilt, crying, intimidation, had failed. And when nothing worked, they had no choice but to accept the new rules. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had insisted from the beginning that the spare key was for safety. Yet the only thing that truly brought safety into our home was refusing to give them one. For the first time since moving into the house, I walked through each room without wondering if someone had been inside during the day. The curtains stayed where I left them. The laundry stayed in the basket. The fridge was untouched. Months later, during a quiet evening, I sat on the porch with my husband. He admitted he never thought his parents would respect the rules, but even he had to admit they had finally changed their behavior. Not because they wanted to, but because every path back to their old ways had been shut down. It wasn't the warm resolution some people hope for in family stories. They didn't apologize sincerely, and they didn't become model-in-laws overnight, but they learned that boundaries weren't optional. They learned that their son and his wife weren't people they could control anymore. And that, more than anything, was the victory.